Strive is a research consortium with partners in different parts of the world, led from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Please, you're very welcome to go to our website if you haven't already, and to sign up for invitations to our regular webinars and to our digest updates. Laurie Heise is going to be our presenter today. She's one of the research directors for Strive and was very instrumental in establishing the research consortium. You probably know her, as she has a very strong reputation both in the violence field and in HIV. I'm going to hand over to Laurie to take it from here. Thanks again.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. I see and recognize many of the names on the list, so I feel like I'm preaching a bit to the choir, and I love to have the choir chip in as we go along. For those who aren't familiar, I wanted to say just a bit to begin with about Strive. We are, as Annie said, a research consortium that includes partners in South Africa and Tanzania, India, DC, and here in London. And we're really focused on trying to understand what we call the upstream factors, so the causes of causes, the things that create the environments in which people have to make their decisions every day, and really influence the degree to which women and men can actually take action to protect themselves from HIV. And so on this slide, you see a couple of our working groups that we have going, but we mostly work on alcohol availability and drinking norms, insecure livelihoods, transactional sex, some of the issues around gender norms and violence, out of which this report came. And it's really an effort to both try to address not only HIV risk, but the other development outcomes, unwanted pregnancies, STDs, maternal mortality, and other issues, which are very much influenced by these structural and environmental circumstances in which people find themselves. So today, what I really wanted to do is share with you some of the discussions that some of you actually were involved in because you were at the meeting, but that went on in a meeting that was hosted at the Greentree Foundation, which is on Long Island, and was an effort to try to look at and better understand what we know and what we don't know, what remains yet to be learned about the relationship between violence against women and HIV. So just to sort of put ourselves in history here, I wanted to locate violence within the HIV discourse. And by that I mean, if you look back to when Strive began and we were thinking about the issue of violence against women in the context of programming around HIV, this slide is sort of probably familiar to many people, is the investment framework that UNAIDS put forward to say this is how we suggest that countries think about their basic programming related to HIV. And what you see here, you follow this little green arrow, is you see that there's some basic building blocks, which are the things you might expect: condom promotion and distribution, voluntary male circumcision, work with key populations, and the like. These are sort of the core that every program should have. Then on the left-hand side here, they have what they call critical enablers, which are the social and program enablers which help achieve the environment which will allow these programmatic services-based interventions work. And so they have things here related to stigma reduction, mass media, and legal changes and the like. At the very bottom of the screen, though, you see something that says synergies with the development sector. And these were things which UNAIDS and HIV programmers recognized were important, but more or less they argued were outside of the purview of what HIV dollars should be spent on. And so here you have some of the things like gender equality, poverty reduction, and gender-based violence. And again, it was not that there shouldn't be programming in this area, but it shouldn't necessarily come out of the HIV budget. So when we began, gender-based violence was quite marginalized, I would say, within HIV programming. We also, though, had, at the same time, in the non-HIV world, the emergence of a very strong sort of counter-discourse, that said that violence against women was absolutely key to women's vulnerability to HIV. And this was also a time where we saw the emergence of what was a very kind of strong focus on sexual violence, and especially sexual violence in the situations of conflict or emergencies. For example, several years ago, you might recall the UK government, when it had the presidency of the European Union, had a big global summit on sexual violence and conflict, and it had Angelina Jolie and all these various different people. And this was actually quite controversial within some of the women's movements here in the UK, not because rape and war is not a horrible thing, but that the kind of selecting out sexual violence, even in the context of war, is ignoring other elements of violence as they affect women's lives, and also that it tended towards saying that if the problem was rape by combatants, then the solution to violence in women's lives was prosecution of war criminals for rape as a war crime. So those are two type things happening in the background. This is when we came together as a community and really said, okay, our job as a consortium is to really try to sort out what do we know about the association between violence and HIV. So in what ways, if any, does violence increase women's individual risk of acquiring HIV? To what extent is it a driver of HIV incidence at a population level? And so the difference there being, clearly, if a woman is raped by someone who's HIV positive and she becomes HIV positive, you know, that act of violence is substantially increasing her risk. You can have many instances of that and still not have violence as a driver of influencing the overall levels of violence in particular areas. So that's what we mean by population level risk. And then finally, what impact, if any, or what evidence do we have, if any, of the role that violence may play on HIV-related programming? So things like women's willingness to come forward for HIV testing or to share their status, their ability or willingness to take up and try to adhere to some of the new biomedical options that are becoming available, like pre-exposure prophylaxis and the new vaginal rings, and then also use and adherence to antiretroviral therapy, both for HIV-positive women and for those who might be going on treatment as a form of prevention. So this is the questions that we pose to ourselves. We came together in this absolutely beautiful foundation that was on Long Island. And what was interesting about this group, it was that it was a real mix of everything from basic scientists who worked on mucosal immunity, for example, to political scientists, to sociologists, from practitioners to researchers. And the reason it was called Greentree II is that there actually had been a Greentree I, which Strive had not been involved in directly, and had the questions that have been posed in that meeting were very much focused on the potential biological piece of the puzzle. So to what extent did genital trauma or injury from sexual violence influence women's risk of HIV. Again, I think coming out of this strong discourse that was being discussed at the global stage level. So we posed our question slightly more broadly, and our objectives were to review the epidemiology of violence against women and HIV. I think that's missing from the slide. I apologize. But then also to critically assess the evidence that existed in terms of linkages between violence and the risk of acquiring HIV. Third was to look at pathways, because there are actually quite a few, and we'll talk about these, ways in which could account for an association between types of violence and women's risk of HIV, and exactly which pathway or which combinations of pathways seem to be the most operative could really strongly influence where we might want to most invest our energy and resources, at least from an HIV perspective. And then thirdly, we wanted to look at what do we know, what is the evidence that exists about how violence intersects or influences the uptake and adherence to both biomedical prevention and treatment. So with that charge, let me just briefly go over some of what we know about the epidemiology of these overlapping epidemics. And I suspect that for many of those of you on the call, this will be familiar territory. So one of the things that I think has become ever more present and recognized in the global AIDS pandemic is the terrible burden that HIV is placing on young adolescent girls in sub-Saharan Africa. So in Eastern and Southern Africa, HIV is the leading cause of death among girls 15 to 19, and this comes out of the global burden of disease evidence. We also know that adolescent girls are where we see some of the greater proportion of new infections. So adolescent girls have all of the new infections in 15 to 19-year-old girls. 19-year-old individuals, 7 and 10 are amongst girls. So there's a disproportionate burden that they are assuming and are getting infected much younger than their male age mates. So looking a little bit about what we know about the epidemiology of violence, one of the things that is very clear is that violence within intimate partnerships is actually the most common form of violence globally. And what you see here on this slide is actually a proportional Venn diagram of the responses of 24,000 women who were interviewed as part of the WHO multi-country study on domestic violence and women's health. And what you're really looking at is this circle here is all women who responded yes, that they had been physically abused by a partner. This lighter circle is those who said they had been sexually forced to have sex by an intimate partner. And the overlap is people who experience both. These smaller circles down here are the proportion of these same 24,000 women who experience sexual abuse in childhood, defined here as before age 15, or sexual abuse in adolescence and adulthood by someone other than an intimate partner. And visually, what the main message here is, while there's enormous risks that women face in terms of sexual violence in their lives, both as children and as adults, it's still outweighed by the volume of violence that women experience from partnerships. And in fact, you often see here this darker area is the overlap between the 4 different types of violence. So, moving on, this is a slide that I actually personally, even though we helped create it, don't like. And what it is a slide looking at the global burden of violence and from intimate partners, physical and or sexual, which shows that about 1 in 3 women, or 30% globally, will experience violence within their lifetimes. And then it's broken down by region. This, again, is part of the global burden of disease exercise. The reason I don't like this slide is because I think it covers up a lot, or it communicates a much greater commonality or evenness of violence than we actually experience. And what I mean by that is this is lifetime violence. So here, if you look at the U.S., 23% of women will have experienced physical or sexual violence at least once. That may be something as minor as a slap, or it could be as severe as multiple, battering kind of relationships. The difference being that if you look at the annual rate, or the current violence rate, it's about 4% in the U.S. It's likewise about 4% in lots of Europe and in Australia. If you look over in other parts of the world, which are admittedly the lifetime rates are higher, the thing that's really important to notice, though, or to be aware of, is that while 37 or 38% of women in Southeast Asia may report violence in their lifetime, the current rate of violence is not that much different. So rather than 23% and 4% in the last 12 months, you'll have like 37% and 30%. So, and I think that's indicative of the fact that women living in these environments have a lot less opportunity to leave abusive relationships that put them at risk. Another reason that I think that slide can be somewhat distorting in terms of message is if you go down at a provincial level. So this is Africa now, using demographic and health survey data, looking at prevalence by province or district. The red here is any district that has more than 70 to 100% of women who have been beaten in the last 12 months. The very light color is up to 10%. And you start to see this very mottled picture where you have lots of variation. And if I took this slide down to the next level and went to the level of the cluster as opposed to the province, you would see even more variation. And one of the things that doesn't come across in these large averages is that you can have a village where 30% of the women are being beaten, and then straight down the road a village where 80% are being beaten. And so one of the most important messages is to realize these very high variations and try to understand the cause of the variation so that we can both target resources and we can get some insights for prevention. So this is another set of surveys that are currently being undertaken by UNICEF together with the Centers for Disease Control and Together for Girls. And they're actually interviewing young people under the age of 24, so 13 to 24-year-olds, and asking them about their experiences of physical and sexual violence. One of the things that I find somewhat, again, distorting about the way these numbers are presented is they're talked about in terms of children being anyone under 18, which, of course, is how it is defined in treaties related to the rights of the child. But what happens then is you get what we would classically think about as child sexual abuse mixed in with things that we would normally consider things related to dating or partner violence, because there's many adolescent girls in the world who are married before the age of 18, for example. So here we have what you see is 1 in 4 girls across the board in these settings experienced sexual abuse prior to 18 and 1 in 7 boys. However, if we break down by perpetrator, what you see here is of that sexual violence experienced by girls, a very large percentage in some settings, not all, is actually by a husband or an intimate partner. So it's very important that we get behind these numbers and we really start to understand them. Another reason that I focus so much in the data on partner violence versus other things is that not only is it the most common, it's even the most common in situations of conflict or post-conflict settings. So while, again, the issue around rape by combatants and by militia and all of that is a horrific problem that we must take on, we cannot forget that the woman who may be a victim of an armed combatant is also suffering from many other types of abuse. So this is an example from my colleague, Mazeda Hussein, who was looking at sexual violence in 12 different conflict-affected zones in Côte d'Ivoire. And here you see 29%. So of the 33% of women who reported sexual violence, 29% reported their husband or intimate partner as a perpetrator, and only 3% identified an armed combatant. Likewise, you see similar kinds of things in the DRC. Again, it's not to say that these other types of violence are not important, but just to remind ourselves that even in settings of conflict and things like that, it's some of these more, I hate to use the word mundane, but common forms of violence that actually dominate women's lives. So, in summary of looking at the epidemiology, what we see is that IPV and HIV share many common features. So both are highly endemic in areas of the world, especially East and Southern Africa. Both are very spatially distributed. So you see hot spots and pockets of high and low exposure scattered in close proximity. This is something that the HIV world is starting to take on in terms of targeting its investments and interventions, but it's not been something that has really gotten a lot of attention yet in the IPV community. Both proportionately affect young women, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and both share common upstream factors like insecure livelihoods and rigid gender norms that drive downstream risk. So then what we did is we went on to say, okay, does IPV actually increase risk of acquiring HIV, and if so, through what mechanisms? And this is, at some level, seems like it should be a fairly easy question to answer, but unfortunately the data are very confusing. So there are many, many studies that are cross-sectional that look at the issue of whether there's an association between experience of violence and HIV, or experience of HIV and experience of violence. One of the problems with cross-sectional data, as I'm sure you know, is where you can't tell the direction. Unfortunately, many of the studies themselves actually were conducted poorly and used a way of coding the data that really undermined their utility. So it took quite a while to kind of sort through all this. And there have been two large meta-analyses looking at the association between IPV and HIV, both using demographic and health surveys because we have biological data on HIV and we have modules on domestic violence. Now, the thing that made things even more complicated is that these two different sets of investigators did a similar type of analysis, not exactly the same, and not exactly the same set of DHSs, but one found an association, one found no association. Now, if looking at it and doing all of the work of comparing the quality and how people went about doing this, the Greentree participants felt that the most defensible piece of analysis was done by Durval and Linskamp, and there what we see is a clear association, but one that only remains significant in settings where more than 5% of adults are HIV positive. So that there's a high background rate of HIV. So now, fortunately, we do have some other data that we can bring to bear on this question, and this is actually better data because rather than being cross-sectional, it's cohort data, and we're looking forward at following women over time who are not experiencing partner violence and are not infected, and then experience partner violence, and then have what is called an incident HIV. And there are about 5 different cohort studies. The 3 strongest confirm that there is an association between partner violence and incident HIV. One of the strongest comes from the work of Rachel Jukes in the Lancet, published in the Lancet, where it was following women forward in time as they were involved in a trial to evaluate the stepping stones intervention. And here what you see is, if you go up to here, is women who had experienced more than one episode of physical or sexual partner violence had a 65% greater chance of becoming HIV positive in the follow-up period than women who had not experienced or had experienced none or one episode of violence. And when you look at all of the different prospective studies available, there has been a meta-analysis that shows that there's a 28% increased risk. So this is 65%, this is 28%. This represents the average of a whole bunch of different studies. Now, 28% is a modest increase in risk, but it can nonetheless have a large impact on population levels of HIV because the background prevalence of domestic violence is very high. So if you think about it, if you can either have something that has only a small increase for each person, but almost 60% of the people in the population are affected, or you can have something that has a huge impact in increasing risk, but it only touches a handful of people. So when we're looking at prevention, we really care about these small, modest risks when they influence the risk of a whole bunch of people in the background population. And you can tell that the impact that this could have by looking at some of what's called the attributable fraction of HIV that's due to IPV. So this is basically if everyone who had partner violence in the studies that we were looking at before no longer had partner violence, you would have between 12 and 22% difference in the overall HIV rate. So that gives you a sense of how even a fairly small increase in risk, when spread across a large population, can actually have a big increase or big influence on your levels of HIV. So then we went on to ask ourselves, okay, we've convinced ourselves looking at the data that there is indeed an association, but what does the data tell us, or what can they tell us, if anything, at this point in time about the pathways of influence? And here we worked from this diagram, which is a little bit busy, but let me just talk you through it. So up here we have what we call structural drivers of HIV and intimate partner violence. These are the upstream factors like poverty and economic stress, gender inequality and social norms condoning violence, constructions of masculinity and femininities. These are the things that influence downstream. Okay, when I say downstream, I mean the likelihood of getting HIV risk. And in between, you have both direct pathways, so that how this influences partner violence, and then partner violence can influence HIV risk through a number of different means. The first set that I highlight here, this is all nicely animated, but I won't do that on here, is biological. So going back to the way people used to think about this problem of HIV is, well, it's an issue of forced sex. The forced sex causes genital trauma or causes inflammation and recruits immune cells, which are the targets of HIV, and that somehow sexual violence through these more proximate mechanisms is what's increasing women's risk of acquiring HIV. Interestingly enough, that pathway actually doesn't have a lot of evidence to support it thus far. And in fact, there's quite a bit of counter evidence that suggests that even in settings where physical abuse or control seems to be influencing HIV acquisition, sexual violence does not seem to be associated with that HIV acquisition. And that's not to say, again, that individual women can't become infected through rape, but it's only in a few exceptions in all of the studies that we reviewed that confirmed that an association on average between forced sex and HIV. Now, why might that be the case? It seems sort of counterintuitive. And I think one of the ways I have thought about this is if you think about HIV, the thing that drives a woman's risk more than anything else is whether or not her sexual partner is infected. So she could have all sorts of other risk factors or other kinds of behavioral things that would, in other circumstances, put her at higher risk. But if she's having sex with someone who's not infected, it's not going to influence her risk of acquiring HIV. And since we know from the global data and from a lot of national and local data that most forced sex takes place within ongoing relationships, it's probably the repeated exposure to an HIV-positive partner rather than any added risk from the genital trauma that's driving the relationship. So, it's not to say that it never happens, but if you're looking across the lifetime of exposure, you might have a woman who occasionally has a partner who forces her to have sex, and then on other nights and other weeks has sex consensually, and it's the frequency of exposure that sort of washes out any added risk that may be caused by genital trauma. That's a theory, that's not proof, but some way to think about it. One of the things that is interesting, though, and this is some of the work that came out of Greentree I and then a follow-up meeting that the National Institutes of Health held after Greentree II, was that more important perhaps than genital trauma is mental trauma and stress. And there's starting to be studies that are showing that physical and emotional abuse of women actually up and down regulates women's genital immune response. And what that means is it turns on and off certain kinds of pathways which make women either more or less susceptible to infection. We also see over here, higher rates of depression and lower T-cell function in women who experience chronic abuse, and that PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, is associated with dysregulation of the stress pathway. So there's starting to be some interesting, but still at this point just suggestive evidence that we might have a more systemic impact on immune function that may make women who are subject to abuse at higher biological risk of acquiring HIV. So now, if we go back to our diagram here and we look at the next set of possible mechanisms of direct association between partner violence and HIV, is what I call the fear and control box. And here we have women who are living in abusive relationships and can't control or may be afraid to seek services, who may be afraid to or unable to negotiate safer sex or have lower adherence. All of these things, you could imagine a way in which they could increase your risk of acquiring HIV. And sure enough, when we did a systematic review of what was known about partner violence and engagement in HIV care and treatment among women, what we see is across the board that fear of violence reduces women's willingness to test. Anticipated violence lengthens the time between finding out that you're HIV positive and linkage to care. History of physical or sexual IPV decreases ART uptake. Current IPV is linked to poor ART adherence. And gender-based violence itself is associated with poor HIV outcomes. So it looks as if it may affect, again, this immune response where you have increased virological failure and more opportunistic infections. So back to our favorite diagram. Now we're looking at indirect pathways. So there's also, in addition to these direct pathways, two sets of indirect pathways through which violence may be increasing women's HIV acquisition. One starts in the woman's childhood with sexual abuse. And one of the things that we know is that women who are sexually abused as a child are at much higher risk in adolescent and adulthood to a series of mental and behavioral responses which can place them at increased risk of infection. So it's associated with chronic anxiety and depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use. It's also highly linked to increased sexual risk-taking. So women who are abused in childhood are more likely to find themselves abused in the future as adults. They're more likely to have multiple and concurrent partners, to engage in sex work or transactional sex. So it could be that this early abuse sets up a cascade of responses which, through her own sexual behavior, might be increasing women's risk of violence. Now, on the other side, you see a similar pattern with men. So one of the things that we know with men is that men who are exposed to violence in childhood, whether that be physical, harsh discipline, whether it be observing or witnessing his mother being beaten or being beaten himself, it sets up, again, a cascade of behavioral responses. In this case, what we see is a clustering of risk where the same men who beat their wives or who are violent with their wives tend to be much higher likely to be binge shriekers, to have concurrent partners, and to purchase sex, to engage in anal sex, and some other high-risk behaviors. Now, if that's the case, what we do know from studies is that these men are more likely to become HIV positive because then she has a higher likelihood via exposure that she is more likely to become HIV positive. So one of the big questions in these indirect pathways is there any evidence either that through her own outside sexual behavior or through her partner's sexual behavior that this is part and parcel of how we see this association. So there was a number of people who presented at the conference and elsewise who were testing these competing hypotheses. So meaning trying to figure out which seems the most significant, these direct links through biology or immune activation or inability, fear and control, or some of these indirect links. And I don't have time today to go into the description of some of the really elegant kinds of epidemiological studies that people have done to look at, to kind of compare these different ideas. But what I will say is so far, and again, I think more work needs to be done, is that the current evidence, mostly again from demographic and health surveys where we have both biological HIV data and IPV data, seems to point to this idea of the clustering of risk behaviors among men. So there doesn't seem to be increased risk. It doesn't seem to be operating through her sexual behavior. There is some evidence that is operating through abuse in the relationship itself, but again, not significantly the sexual abuse, but just the power, control, and physical abuse. And there seems to be, there's strong evidence that there is this clustering, and it seems to be one of the reasons that women are finding themselves at higher risk. So this suggests that HIV programs should focus both on this risky behavior among the men themselves, so violence as a marker for HIV risk, and the upstream factors that we were talking about that influence both your risk of partner violence and your risk of HIV. So I just want to end with some emerging evidence about what can be done in terms of programming. And this is 16 days of activism. Is the color is orange, and violence is not inevitable. And we are now getting, I think, some really exciting evidence about ways in which programs are able to reduce risk of IPV and sometimes concurrently HIV. So one of the most discussed trials, because it had both an HIV endpoint and an IP endpoint, is the SHARE trial, which stands for Safe Homes and Respects for Everyone. It was a project that took place in Rakai, Uganda, between 2005 and 2009. And it was a combination of community-based mobilization to change norms around IPV and offer integrated violence and HIV prevention programming at a community level, together with trying to offer some brief intervention and screening to address IPV in the context of HIV testing and counseling. And the results of this trial showed that the intervention was able to reduce both HIV incidence and physical and sexual IPV as reported by women. It didn't actually appear to affect IPV as reported by men, and we can have a discussion about that if people are interested. But more or less what we see published here in the Lancet is a trial where we were able to through IPV-related programming, reduce not only IPV but HIV. Another program which many of you I'm sure are familiar with is SASA, which also takes place in Uganda and is a community mobilization program that's geared both towards reducing HIV risk and reducing IPV. And in the trial that was evaluated, this project that's co-done by Raising Voices and SECOVIP, which is a local Ugandan NGO, they showed that they were able to achieve shifts in attitudes supporting of wife beating, reductions in past year occurrence of physical violence among women with a history of violence. So this was it was better. This intervention was better at stopping repeat violence than it was at stopping any violence from starting. Reductions in the number of concurrent partners among men, and also increases in women's ability to refuse sex, amongst many other secondary outcomes. I just put this last slide up here just to show that these two are just a handful among some of the various different interventions which have been rigorously evaluated in trials and have shown some positive impacts on incidence of HIV and or IPV. And so I think we are on our way to understanding a bit about how we can start to co-program in this area. So thinking about recommendations, I mean, obviously there's many, many recommendations, but one thing is I think we need to start to adapt and implement the programs that we do have evidence can reduce violence and improve HIV outcomes on a wider scale. I think the DREAMS effort, which is sponsored by the U.S. government, has, on paper attempted to take on board girls and risk of violence, and has said that they're going to try to integrate and roll out SASA as part of their multi-component effort to reduce HIV amongst young girls in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem here is that there just really is not a lot of capacity to implement, and these are specialized programs, and they require a certain political perspective and understanding of the issue. And so I think one of our challenges will be to scale up the ability of more and more actors to actually do this kind of programming. I also think we could be doing much more with trying to prioritize hotspots where both violence and HIV levels are high. And what you see is UNAIDS and country-level programs, the Global Fund, are starting to really target programs in the areas of greatest need. And we can do that very same sort of mapping. And it would be interesting to put those two maps over the top of each other and think about whether or not that would change our priorities. Finally, I think we should think about whether we can explore opportunities to help women identify high-risk men by using binge drinking and violence as a marker for HIV risk. And what I mean by that is I think emotionally it's very difficult, or one of the harder things, to think about a partner of yours putting you at risk of HIV. And sometimes it's more stigmatized than even violence or drinking. And in many settings, women talk about their husbands drinking a lot. They talk about violence a lot. And one of the things that we know is that these things all co-occur. So if your husband drinks and he's violent, you are at much higher risk of HIV than if your partner doesn't. And finally, I think we need to really do some more research, because this is all very tentative. But as you can see, if depending on which of these pathways appear to become appear more important, it would change quite a bit where we put or not quite a bit, but it could change how we would target our resources. So I'm going to stop there, and all of this is available on the Strive website in the Greentree report in much greater detail than I could present it to you today. And I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors who helped us pull off the meeting and the report, which is the Greentree Foundation, UNICEF, UNAIDS, World Health Organization, and of course the main donor for Strive, which is the UK Department of International Development. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laurie. I see we're starting to get some questions. We have about 10 minutes left. So Ellen Weiss asks, Ellen Weiss asks, do you know of any evidence of the impact of using HIV testing and care platforms in addressing violence against women on the uptake of HIV care and treatment services and on violence against women?
I know that there has been, I know there's some people who are starting to think about this. I've mostly been familiar with people who have been doing trials like microbicide trials and PrEP and trying to integrate HIV screening and referral and things into those trials. someone else on the call may know more about the service end than I do, but it seems like it would be a worthwhile thing to pursue.
Great. Laura Chiang asks, there seemed to be an early focus on sugar daddies in terms of HIV risk for young women, as well as risk for IPV. However, some more recent research seems to suggest that older partners can actually be protective for HIV. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the issue, we've done quite a bit of work, and if you're interested, there's a number of Strive webinars on this in terms of transactional sex. It's a really complicated issue. I think one of the failures of the discourse on transactional sex in the HIV world is the assumption that all transactional sex is actually kind of intergenerational and kind of older sugar daddy and younger girls, because actually quite a bit of it is slightly older boys, so I think there's been, I think there's been some interesting work that Salim Karim has done in KwaZulu-Natal, showing that actually you do see in that region older men, not super old, like so 5 to 7 years older, infecting younger girls, and then those girls go on to infect their age mate partners. And they're using for the first time tracing of the genetic, I don't know exactly the technique, but they're actually looking at the virus to be able to match up where the viruses are coming from. So, I think we do need to have a more fulsome discussion on the role of transactional sex and what is really going on. We've been trying under Strive to do work on refining our measures and our conceptualization, and I would offer up a really excellent article that was first authored by our colleague who was then at ICRW and is now at American University, Kirsten Stovenow, about that's a review of what we know about transactional sex. But it is associated, we did a systematic review, and it is associated with higher HIV risk, but not all of that is the kind of classic sugar daddy kind of trope.
Great. Janine Carmichael asks, what do you think are the highest research priorities to address gaps in current knowledge?
Well, I actually would really like to see I'd like to get a better handle on the relative contribution of these different pathways, because I think it leads us in different potential directions. And, I don't feel very confident, to be honest, about all of the conclusions that we're offering up in this report, in the sense this is the best we can do with the data that are available. But, for example, if it turns out that genital trauma is not that important, that's going to lead us in one direction. If it turns out that actually immune activation and immune suppression is really important, that's going to lead us in another. And if it turns out that it's actually the behavior of the male partners, that will lead us in yet another direction. So I would like to see us try to get a better handle on exactly the ways in which these various pathways influence women's risk.
We have a couple more minutes, so if anyone wants to, would like to unmute themselves by pressing *7 on their phone and join the conversation live, please go ahead. That would be fine.
I mean, I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts about. I have to admit, I'm slightly anxious about this presentation. And the reason being is I know that we, as someone who's committed to working on violence against women and women in HIV, that once you actually get down into the weeds, you lose the clarity of your story and your moral high ground, and we can make quite the case in a rhetorical way, about the links and vulnerability and all of that. And I know that in trying to take us down to the level of the messiness of the data and everything, that we risk that clarity of purpose and that kind of claim, rhetorical claim on both communities to address women's needs. But at the same time, I'm too much of a kind of closet researcher that I do worry that we not waste money. So I just being very honest about my ambivalence about trying to sort this out in any way beyond the rhetorical.
Does anyone have any comment to make on that, on those reservations? I don't think, Laurie, you've actually been in the closet as a researcher, but I understand your point. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I'd like to ask you to please fill in a small questionnaire or one question that will come up on your screen when you finish. We have Anne Stangl. She really appreciates the level of detail and the effort to understand the pathways. She thinks it's important for developing interventions. This is kind of and a nice question. Bravo, Laurie, for your honesty. Even if we also have the argument that it's a human rights violation.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate everyone's giving us this time, and look forward to, continuing the fight. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.